try that. Do you see a slide? Okay, thank you. Excellent. So, welcome. I'm going to start with the kind of two fundamental ideas that in relation to one another helped us conceive of this particular program. Right? These two. The first is that the humanities have a lot to offer the world, right? That training in the humanities helps us think and act and relate to people in really powerful, transformative ways that can really contribute to the broader communities we're a part of. So that's first, right? That the humanities have a lot to offer, but that's always in relation to the second, which is that humanists have a lot to learn, right? That this isn't about us all being experts who go out and just help people based on our advanced education, right? All that. Is that doing that, moving across context, understanding what people need is hard and takes work and takes learning. And there are skills that you need in order to make a positive impact, right? And that always this work should be reciprocal, right? That it's not unidirectional. Right, so it's kind of these things together give us the idea to have this program that would connect humanities graduate students with community organizations to learn from and benefit from one another. And so that's the Humanities Without Walls Summer Bridge experience. So basically, this is a program where fellows are matched with a community organization in the Champaign-Urbana area, and they work with them for about 20 hours a week for 8 weeks, for 2 months in the summer. Right? And generally are working, and I'll talk through some examples later on projects that contribute to kind of fundamental needs of the organization. Right? The matching with community organizations happens after the fellows are selected and is done through our partnership with WeCU, which is a public engagement and service learning unit on campus. And so based on what the selected fellows want to learn and also the sort of skills and expertise they have to contribute, WeCU and Humanities Without Walls finds a good match and facilitates that. I'll just note this program overall, like all of Humanities Without Walls, is supported by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So why might you want to participate in this? I think you probably all have some thoughts about this since you're here, right? Something about the call for applications appealed to you, but I like to think about this as a really useful opportunity to get to apply your training, use the stuff you know and you know how to do in new ways, right? To kind of break out of the set paths, the set sort of tracks you've been on, and use that humanistic knowledge in new ways to contribute in a substantive and reciprocal way to a community organization, right? So to take the stuff that you've been doing to, do research and write your dissertation, right? Take some of that and make a really positive impact with it. It's also a chance to learn new things and stretch yourself in new ways that can prepare you for a wider variety of career paths. It's an opportunity to explore nonprofits as a site of work and some different kinds of tasks and projects to see what kind of works for you and what doesn't. Also, it pays, and it pays pretty well. Fellows earn up to $6,800 in the summer. And I'll flag here that once people are selected, they'll talk with us and with some people who work in policy, in HR, and the graduate college to figure out, they're just like different tax stuff that goes on based on whether or not you're enrolled in the summer. But the base pay is up to $6,800 for the summer, and you also get throughout the 8 weeks, and really in the time leading up to the experience, some mentorship and support from me and from the wonderful Peggy Brennan, who's on the call today, to help you really align this experience with your career development and help you figure out how to use this to move in a direction that's going to be useful to you. Any questions at this point about just the like basic logistics of how the program works? Okay. So I want to talk through some examples from last year, because one of the I think, I don't know, challenges, but maybe exciting challenges of the application process for this, which we'll talk about later, is that we don't know, and you don't know in advance what exactly you'd be doing in the summer if you apply, right? That it's an exercise in speculative fiction, in using your imagination to think about it. But these examples can maybe give you a sense of the kind of thing you might end up doing. So last year we had 4 fellows at 4 different community organizations. So one of them, a graduate student in the English department, was matched with First Followers, which is a local organization focused on post-incarceration reentry programs. And that fellow worked with them on doing some research and benchmarking for large-scale multi-organization collaborations as they planned to expand their work in concert with other groups in town. And so they did research into what that has looked like in other cities, looked into some published sort of academic research on community collaborations, and attended and participated in a lot of meetings at the beginning of the partnership building process last summer. Another fellow, graduate student in anthropology, worked at the Up Center, local LGBTQ community center, on taking a survey about sex education that they were doing that was in English and translating it into Spanish, right? But I think more important or more robustly than translation, also helping the Up Center understand the particular Spanish-speaking populations in Champaign-Urbana that they wanted to reach, and how to kind of localize, not just shift words from English to Spanish, but make sure the survey was doing the work. And so they had the chance to kind of use their anthropological training in culture and context to drive that. Another fellow, a graduate student in history, worked with Project Success in Vermilion County, which is the county just to the east of us. And Project Success runs a bunch of after-school programs for children. And this fellow worked with them to identify needs and priorities for a new website and build out a website for them. And then finally, we had a fellow graduate student in English who was placed at the Women's Resource Center to do some things that they'll tell you about now. So maybe I'll pass it over to Erin if you want to just kind of talk about what you did, what you got out of it, anything you want to share would be great.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Okay, awesome. So I am a PhD student in English, and for the program last summer, I was paired with the Women's Resource Center. So I was actually really excited about that pairing because going into this, I thought that like my opportunities might be focused exclusively on nonprofits, but the Women's Resource Center is a community organization, but it's also located on campus. So I was able to explore some diverse careers within higher education. So with my pairing with the Women's Resource Center, I kind of started off at the beginning of the summer, meeting with my supervisor, who was really wonderful. And we sat down and talked about like, what was I interested in? My cat's joining the conversation. What was I interested in? What type of projects would help me most with my career development and what I wanted to get out of the experience? So as a result, we came up with a project that I was going to be working on the PHI-CARE program at the University of Illinois, which is a required program for all freshmen and transfer students about sexual assault, violence, and prevention on campus. And so I did a review of that program from an accessibility standpoint. So that involved several different parts. It started off at the beginning of the summer where I conducted a bunch of research that was very similar to research that I am used to doing as a PhD student in the humanities, but for a different end. So I ended up compiling a report based off of empirical research of best practices that the PHI-CARE program could implement to make it more accessible for students with disabilities. So that was kind of the first major part of my project. I then also ended up kind of stepping into manage part of the PHI-CARE program. So I would say one of the major challenges that I encountered last summer was learning about how community organizations are often understaffed and underfunded. So I was kind of, you know, given the whole experience of what that's like. So I ended up working on managing a lot of the PHI-CARE project. So I managed undergraduate student workers, worked on scheduling, worked on setting up technical logistics, basically all aspects of the summer PHI-CARE program. As a result of my work with Humanities Without Walls, the Women's Resource Center actually ended up hiring me beyond just the course of my internship, and I was able to stay on through the end of the summer beyond the 8 weeks. They also asked me if I would stay on for the school year. I already had a fellowship lined up, but it did kind of lead to these potential long-term career opportunities at the Women's Resource Center. Since the Humanities Without Walls Fellowship, I have also, you know, maintained my connections with the Women's Resource Center. Derek and Peggy have both been wonderful resources. Some things that kind of came out of this in addition to the actual projects that I was working on and the work that I was doing is learning about diverse careers in higher education administration overall. So prior to entering this program, I knew things that like informational interviews would be really helpful for me to do for my career development, but I was always too anxious to actually do them. So having the guidance of the program and like being required to learn more about diverse careers kind of helped me take that step. So one thing that I found really helpful over the summer was not only doing the work, but also the support that Humanities Without Walls provides with Derek and Peggy and others. And so I did a ton of informational interviews and that was really helpful. I'd say one takeaway that I learned from those informational interviews and this education overall is someone said to me during an informational interview that like what I want to do in making a step outside of academia, none of my professors can actually help me with, because they have never made that step before. So like what I want to do is completely different than what so many academics are trained in, and how a lot of times our department supports us. So I ended up finding, the support and information that I learned from the summer super, super helpful. I've now started working on a few job applications. I've been able to write about my experiences from the summer. And yeah, I'd say my only regret about the program is I participated last summer. This is my final year of graduate school. I actually feel like it would have been helpful if I had done it earlier, because I learned about so many opportunities that I could have taken advantage of, that I was only just finding out about at the conclusion of my degree. So yeah, I think that it would be an immensely helpful experience at any stage of the graduate program, and I'm happy to speak to questions about that later.
Erin, I'll start with a question. Everybody else, feel free type questions in chat or raise your hand, but ask you to talk a little bit, if you can, about how you brought your training in the humanities and the kind of ways of looking at the world you've developed through humanistic inquiry and your graduate education to this role. Like, how do you think being a humanist shaped how you undertook the projects?
Yeah, so I think partially it was through sort of tangible skills. So for instance, doing all this research and compiling all this research and then just putting it into a different format. So rather than writing like a peer-reviewed article, I was writing a report that could actually lead to tangible changes. So I think things like those research skills, those communication skills really came into play. I think that for me, what I find most important about being a humanist is not even just those sort of tangible skills like in researching, but more of an approach to the world. So just kind of approaching this experience, trying to learn something, again, focusing on that slide that you had from the beginning about like humanists have a lot to learn as well. So kind of just taking this approach to the program of what I wanted to learn from it, I found super helpful in just being able to kind of absorb the experience and roll with all the different changes and try to absorb and learn as much as possible.
Questions from anyone else? I have a question for you about the application process, but I'll wait for that maybe until after I explain it. So somebody asks, speaking of the humanists have a lot to learn idea, what do you feel is something you learned coming out of the experience that you didn't know initially?
Thanks, that's a really great question. Basically everything, I guess. For me personally, as a grad student, I started my PhD directly from undergrad, so I never had any work experience aside from, my retail jobs. So I like getting immersed in this kind of work experience was completely different to me than, approaching a classroom. So just kind of seeing how organizations work. So for instance, I was able to go to all of the Women's Resource Center team meetings and just kind of understanding like how everybody collaborates and works in this particular setting was really helpful. I also kind of got this sort of project management experience from working on the FICARE program specifically and supervising undergraduates and doing all these technical logistics that were just, I feel like, somewhat similar skills to what goes into classroom management, but in a completely different setting. So kind of understanding how what I've learned in the classroom and in research and in writing and in teaching might translate into a completely different setting.
And I think that's consistent with what we heard from the other fellows last summer, that they're like specific, sometimes even technical skills like web design, or figuring out what a web host is and how it works, right? But also, and maybe even more importantly, is experiencing a very different context, a different kind of work environment, getting to see nonprofits or nonprofit-like spaces at work, sometimes for better or worse. Having worked at a nonprofit myself, before I joined the graduate college, right? They're complicated places in a different way than, say, an academic department is a complicated place. And I tend to think humanists are well set up to navigate that, to really understand sort of cultures and contexts and communities, but actually getting the experience of navigating that, I think, is really valuable. Other questions? Just, I'm curious, Erin, do you see any connections between the work you did with FICARE, with Women's Resource Center, and the content of your research? I ask that because for some people last year, there were connections. For other ones, there aren't. There's no need for there to be a connection, but I'm curious if you saw anything there.
For me, there was no direct connection between my work and my research and the community organization work that I did. So I'm in English. All my work centers around gender studies, but more around the sort of theoretical realm. So I work on climate change and queer theory. So there was sort of this like tangential connection between the fact that the Women's Resource Center focuses on gender equity, but a lot of people come to that perspective from experience in sexual violence prevention training, which often happens more in the community or from a particular theoretical orientation within the field. So for me, it was completely separate, but still really useful to see how like gender equity might play out in a completely different way than the sort of theoretical focus of my research.
Excellent. So why don't I shift to talk a bit about the application process, and I'll have a question or two for you there, Erin, if you're up for it. Great. Do we see the slide? Great, thanks. Okay, let's talk application process, the sort of basics. It's due March 1st. And to be eligible, you need to be currently enrolled in a PhD program at the university in the humanities or humanistic social sciences, which is sort of deliberately a little bit vague. If you feel kind of interpolated by those categories, I encourage you to apply. You'll need to be graduating after May 22nd. So basically August 20, I say May 22nd, May 2022. So basically August or later as a graduation date. You need to be currently enrolled during the program. I want to note international students are eligible. This is paid through the university, so does not trigger or require use of CPT. So there are three different pieces of the application. I'm going to walk through those. First one is a resume or a CV. Right? And this is basically used by the selection committee for context, right? It's to help us just sort of see what you've been up to. And this document, like everything else, is also used by We See You to help them make a strong match with a community organization, right? So we are not picky at all about what these documents look like, but some record of your experience, whether that's a resume or a CV, is the first piece. Second one is the most important. We ask for 3 different statements. And I'm gonna kind of walk through each of these, kind of talk about them a little bit. And Erin, to give you a heads up, I'm gonna ask you about particularly statement number 1, and what you remember of how you thought about that. Because I think statement number 1 is the most important, but it's also challenging, right? Because we ask you to write in no more than 500 words about what skills, areas of knowledge, or ways of looking at the world that you could use to help a community organization make a positive impact. So you're thinking about how you can foresee applying your humanistic training to advance an organization's mission. This is the piece that is what I called earlier kind of speculative fiction, because you don't know what the organization is, you don't know what the project is. And so this isn't a specific proposal, but instead is showing us your thought process, your creativity, your openness to imagining connections between your humanistic training and broader work in the world, right? So I think engaging creatively with the prompt, speculating a bit, is not only okay, but encouraged. Erin, do you have any thoughts on this one as somebody who has been through it?
Yeah, so for me, I think this application is really challenging because 500 words on 300 words is really short, especially for those of us in English who may be a little long-winded. With this first question, the way that I approached it is thinking about what was most important to me about my humanistic training, what are the skills, knowledge, ways of looking at the world that I have brought from my humanistic training. What have I gained from this? For me, what I found most important about my experience as a humanities PhD student is actually in the classroom and my pedagogical development. So I tried to connect what I see as my strengths, which is pedagogy and how I look at the world through a perspective of learning, and applied that to this essay. So just thinking about what are my values and how might I connect it to this particular organization. I also tried to be kind of broad in the speculative fiction work that I was creating. So I wrote about how I was interested in social and environmental justice broadly, because I didn't know which organization I might be paired with. So I didn't want to limit myself and, not get selected because I was only interested in climate change as it is enacted in the rivers in the Champaign area or something. So I wanted to be broad and wrote about social and environmental justice broadly and how that might come into play without really limiting myself with the organizations that I might get paired with.
And I think something that appealed to the selection committee in Erin's statement was the kind of synthesis of different aspects of being a humanities graduate student. So tying the teaching and research and theoretical engagement with climate change and queer theory kind of together, and using that to imagine some different ways that they might contribute. Other successful applicants last year wrote kind of a little bit about their kind of theoretical or methodological commitments, right, that drive their research and how those might translate across context, right? So ethnography, I think, was one that came up. But yeah, I think it's a good idea in this one to like give a couple of possible examples, right, that are imaginary, right, but show you kind of thinking about it. And a tool to help with that, in case it's useful, are the intersect job simulations. And Peggy's going to put a link in the chat. And I know a couple of you in the room I have harassed into maybe doing some of these, but they're basically small little example projects that give you a sense of a kind of work and what it means to do a kind of work. And so if you're faced with this statement number one and you're just like, I have no idea what I'm going to do, you might pick one of those job simulations that's connected to some kind of nonprofit or advocacy work. I think there's one in there on building a tip sheet for lobbyists or for legislators or something like that, a fact sheet, not a tip sheet. But there are other ones like doing a DEI related literature review, I think, is another one. Power mapping for organizational change is one, but kind of pick one of those and do the simulation, and then use that to reflect on how your kind of training or perspective as a humanist shaped how you approached that project, right? It's a way to kind of get a little bit of concrete experience you can use to then kind of spin out your statement number one. Strongly recommend with all of these, but definitely with number one, iteration. So drafting, getting feedback. I think particularly, 500 words is not an enormous number of words, right? But it might make sense to just start with free writing, or start, don't worry about the word count to begin with, and just write and see what comes out. So that's statement number one. Statement number two asks you to think about what you want to get out of this experience, right? So it's, a version of why are you applying, right? And in particular, how is this going to shape your career development, right? And that can be connected to wanting experience in nonprofits. It could be examples of a few different skills you might like to develop, right? This again is used to assess your readiness to integrate this into your career development, and it's used by We See You to identify an organization that really will meet the needs of successful applicants. And a recommended tool there to help you start thinking like the job simulations is Imagine PhD, and in particular, the skills and interest assessments within it. Imagine PhD is a career planning and exploration tool that's designed for humanities and social science students in particular, graduate students in particular. And just doing some of those skills assessments might help you identify like skills you'd like to have, right? Or skills that kind of align with career paths that kind of interest you, but that you haven't had a chance to develop. Any thoughts on this one, Erin? Any beyond what I said?
Yeah, I think for this one, something that was actually really helpful, how Derek, you mentioned, drafting and going through the writing process with this. I definitely spent at least a month on my application, going through several rounds of drafts. And what I actually did is I solicited advice from one of my friends in business. So I had him read over the application that I had written, just to kind of think about how the skills that I'm narrating from a humanities perspective might also translate to like an audience who's more familiar with careers and diverse careers outside of the academy. So kind of having someone read it who was very far outside of my field was actually really helpful too.
That's great. And I'll say this now and then reiterate it later, that the graduate college, the office I run in the graduate college offers one-on-one career advising. And so you're welcome to make an appointment to get feedback on these, with the caveat that you can't meet with me about it because I'm involved in selection, but you can meet with my colleague, Mike, who has kind of a wide range of training and experience that I think can help do that work that Erin was talking about. And I think, yes, perfect. Thanks, Peggy. So the final statement, 300 words, describe a time when you collaborated with others to solve a problem. Basically, because we want the work, your work this summer to be really collaborative and reciprocal, right? We want to learn more about how you think about and approach collaboration, right? And in this one, most basic but important tip, tell a story. Like literally give us an example of a time when you collaborated and how you approach that collaboration. Excellent. So questions about any of these statements? Well, yeah, Jasmine.
I had a question for the last one. Is there anything in particular, like a certain type of collaboration that you're looking for? Because I know there's broad versions of collaboration.
Yeah. No. I would recommend pick an example that captures or illustrates how you tend to approach working with other people. And I think context matters less there. I think in the successful applications last year, there were teaching related, research related, volunteer related things. Like I think context is less important than just giving us a sense of your kind of thought process and your orientation when it comes to the delightful challenge of working with other people. So while people may be typing other questions in the chat, I will say, as Erin said, these are not easy prompts to respond to. And they're, designed that way on purpose, not to be like utterly miserable experiences for you, but to hopefully push you, stretch you a little bit, challenge you to think about the connection between your work in the humanities and other kinds of work you might want to do in new ways, in creative ways. And based on my now like 7 years experience working in graduate college career development, people who can really answer these kinds of questions, right, or who have really thought about questions like this are really set up to have a a smoother and more generative career exploration process, whether they're accepted as fellows or not. Basically, that this will set you up, I think, to be able to talk about your experience in new ways to yourself, but also to potential employers in the future. Cheryl asks a very good question that I can't remember the answer to. Peggy, do you remember how many applicants we had last year?
Yes, we have funding for 4 students.
How many people applied last year?
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, that is, let me find out. Yep, just give me one moment.
Okay. Yes, so we can fund 4. And I would strongly encourage you, even as you're applying or after you apply, if you aren't successful, if you aren't chosen, to make an advising appointment and come talk to me about other kind of internship possibilities or other things you might do this summer to work on your career development and hopefully get paid doing it. Because this is, one, and I think, particularly nice, particularly interesting possibility, but it's not at all the only thing that humanities graduate students can do in the summer to get some interesting work experience. Okay, as Peggy hunts down that number, talk about the last piece of the application process is a recommendation form. So rather than asking for a letter from somebody, we're going to ask you to ask a person to fill out a form with these 3 questions. First, how do they know you? Second, why do they think you're a strong candidate? And third, what they think your primary strengths are in collaboration or community engagement. And we went with a recommendation form for a couple of reasons. I think first of all, I found it tends to be easier for the recommender, right? We ask the questions we want to know the answers for. They don't have to kind of imagine what we're wondering and then craft a whole letter about it. It also, I think, disrupts the, reflexive or automatic submission of letters of recommendation that are mostly about your dissertation, right? That isn't what we need to know to make a decision. So we're really asking the questions we want answers for. And something I will flag here, really, really important, the person who fills this out can be anyone. It can be your advisor, but it does not have to be your advisor. It doesn't have to be a faculty member. Right? Pick somebody who you think can answer these questions on your behalf well. And it doesn't matter who they are. They don't have to be at the university. Right? So you pick a person that can give us useful information about us. So yeah, Peggy, I agree. I think 15, maybe 20, but I don't even think 20. But so there's a link that you'll need to give to your recommender, and they'll fill out the form. And their form does need to be submitted by the deadline of 11:59 p.m. on March 1st. So if you're thinking about applying, I'd say that identify somebody soon and reach out to them, and so on. Any questions about the recommendation form? Yeah, Jasmine asked about the turnaround time from application to selection. We are still in the process of scheduling the selection meeting, so I don't have an exact time for you, but you will have an answer by the end of March at the latest, and I would expect sooner than that. I think last year it was maybe a week or two. Maybe. We want to move fast so that WeSeeU can start doing the matching, and we will ask the successful, the fellows this year. We didn't do this last year, but this year we're going to ask the fellows to meet with their community organization before the end of the semester to just kind of start building a relationship and identifying a project so that doesn't have to kind of happen in a really frantic way right at the beginning of the summer. Just a heads up there. Okay, other questions about any of this? Yeah, Jasmine.
I know you had mentioned the 4 different nonprofits that they have worked with in the past, but I was wondering what other organizations and nonprofits does the WeSeeU also work with as well?
Yeah, so so good news there. WeSeeU has really strong collaborations through a lot of long-term, long-existing projects on campus with a ton of organizations in town. So I don't have an exact number, but it is a very large number. And last year, and what I expect to probably happen this year, is for each fellow, they need, WeSeeU identifies 3 possibilities and then talks with the fellow to identify the one that best fits them, right? So you have some kind of agency in that process. My recollection from last year, there's a lot of really interesting variety in the 3 possibilities. They tended to be pretty different organizations doing different kinds of things with different missions. Gives you a sense there. So Sabrina, organizations are chosen by WeSeeU based on what they know about what organizations need in town. Like a big part of what they do is just maintain relationships and be in conversation with organizations to kind of understand who might benefit from a graduate level student working on a project for them. And then WeSeeU reaches out to the organizations to see if they might be interested and sort of facilitates things from there. And Heather's question, is there a particular point in the summer where the 8 weeks need to take place? No, we can be flexible on that. It needs to be in the summer. And the kind of pay schedule for the summer will be the same for all of the fellows, but the exact 8 weeks can vary, and we'll work with you and the organization once the match has been made to kind of negotiate that. Okay, well, thank you all so much. And thanks immensely to Erin for coming and sharing their experience. Hopefully it helped you kind of get a bit more concrete picture of what this might look like. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out. And I strongly encourage you, go see my colleague Mike for feedback, or go to the writer's workshop for feedback. Because I think you'll benefit a lot from collaboration and from talking to other people in the process of excavating from your head the things you want to say for those statements. So thank you all. And thanks, Peggy, for running the meeting. Have a good rest of your day and enjoy.